What you go through is nothing special. What you go through is nothing special, nothing unique, nothing that needs to be addressed, nothing that a conversation needs to be had about. It's just a bunch of WNBA players crying because a bunch of people that they don't know are saying mean things and leaving nasty messages in their DMs that they have the right to ignore in the first place.
She tired of y'all talking about her. Oh, man, I knew it. I told my son, I say, bro, I believe Caitlin Clark is finna come in this game and just lay it down because of all of the media, all of these negative attention, these negative headlines that keep coming out about her each and every day.
That needs to be had that is really above us, and I think that is the part that we really need to get to. So hopefully at All-Star we can have an opportunity and a conversation because at this time we something needs to change. It's actually disgusting. So I'm glad that Chelsea had an opportunity to speak up and had an opportunity to show that what we've been going through and we're going to continue to go through until we have that conversation. So
never wanted to grow. They wanted the money, they wanted the viewers, but they wanted to still feel insulated. It goes back to the article that I covered on this channel a couple of years ago where they interviewed WNBA fans, old guard fans that had been a fan of this league, and they were talking about, yeah, we don't love the fact that now we go to the arena. Number one, prices that went up. Number two, it's not like it used to be. We used to actually get done watching games at the arena, and then we'd go to the club with the players.
Last week, something happened in the WNBA that hadn't happened in nearly 30 years of professional basketball. A player walked into an arena, suited up for 40 minutes or less, and did something so rare that even the league's greatest legends never managed to pull it off. Not Diana Taurasi, not Sue Bird, nobody. The moment it happened, the internet exploded. Clips spread everywhere. Everyone was talking about it. But here's where it gets interesting. Not everyone was celebrating. Some of the league's biggest names started weighing in, and what they said revealed something way bigger than one incredible game. It exposed a tension that's been building quietly for months, a rift between veteran superstars and a rising phenomenon that nobody in the WNBA saw coming. And next week in Chicago, these two worlds are about to collide in the same locker room, wearing the same jersey. This is the story nobody's really been telling straight. Let's start with what actually happened, because the numbers alone tell you everything you need to know about how dominant Caitlin Clark has become. Against the Seattle Storm, Clark stepped on the court and went to work. By the final buzzer, she'd put up 45 points. She dished out 10 assists. She did both of those things in a single game, which sounds normal until you understand the context. In the history of the WNBA, a league that's been playing games competitively for close to 30 seasons now, nobody had ever done that before. Not once. The closest anyone had come wasn't even in the same area code. This wasn't some obscure statistical coincidence either. This was a foundational record that sits at the intersection of scoring and playmaking, two of the most fundamental ways a player contributes to winning basketball.
This is gonna go to Caitlin Clark and say, Caitlin, here. She's gonna hand Caitlin Clark a letter. Caitlin Clark is gonna read the letter and say, you want me to say this? And A'ja Wilson is gonna be like, no, you're gonna say this. These players are going to put pressure on Caitlin Clark over All-Star break to come out and publicly denounce her fans. Publicly denounce her fans and say, hey, if you act like fans, I don't want you as my fan.
The depth of how rare this is gets heavier when you add one more detail to the story. Clark didn't grind out 38 or 40 minutes to reach those numbers. She wasn't playing the entire game, padding stats in a blowout situation where the outcome was already decided. She was on a restricted workload. The team capped her below 30 minutes of floor time. Think about that for a second. She produced 45 points and 10 assists in a shortened window, which means her actual pace of production was absurd. The rate at which she was generating points and setting up teammates wasn't just great, it was historically efficient. Kelsey Mitchell, her teammate, added 30 points of her own on that same night. The two of them combined for 75 of Indiana's 110 total points. That's nearly 70% of the entire offensive output coming from one half-court partnership. But here's what separates this from just another great performance. Seattle knew exactly what was coming. They'd watched film. They understood that stopping Clark was their primary objective, so they doubled her constantly. Every single time she touched the basketball, the Storm sent extra defenders in her direction, collapsing the defense to make sure she couldn't operate freely. That's a standard defensive strategy, the kind you see in basketball at every level. The problem is, it usually works. When you send two bodies at a ball handler, something has to give. Either the original defender gets beaten because help came too early, or the extra bodies create shooting lanes for role players. It's a calculated risk that most defenses are willing to take because it limits the primary threat. Clark still got to 45 points anyway. That tells you something fundamental about what's happening on the court when she's playing. This wasn't a hot shooting night where everything happened to fall and luck carried her to a big number. This was a player operating on a different level than everyone else sharing the court with her, including her own teammates, and her teammates had great nights too.
Nation didn't defend their own fans that pay them money out of their pockets. They just went along to get along, got along to get along. You get the point. And it's because they're all scared. They don't want to say anything. Oh my God. We don't want to be viewed as an ism or a phobe or whatever. This league is tiring. God.
She also collected 6 steals and 4 blocks, meaning she was impacting the game on both ends of the floor simultaneously. The combination of scoring, passing, and defense at that intensity level, all compressed into under 30 minutes of playing time, created something the box score couldn't fully capture. It was efficiency married to volume, execution married to creativity. Naturally, when a performance like that happens in professional sports, the internet does what the internet always does. Clips started spreading across every platform within hours of the final buzzer. Twitter exploded. Instagram filled up with highlight reels. TikTok turned it into viral moments. The framing was basically identical no matter which account you scrolled past. This is a player who keeps adding to a resume that other people can spend all the time they want talking about, arguing about, and dissecting while she's the only one actually doing it on the court. The 40-point, 10-assist combo had never happened in WNBA history. That's the level of rare we're talking about. Not with the greatest players of the previous generation. Not with anyone. Clark became the first, and when you're breaking records that span 3 decades of elite professional basketball, you're not just having a good night. You're writing history.
Asia Wilson sending a message to Caitlin Clark. I'm gonna see you at All-Star Weekend. And when I see you, we gonna talk. It ain't gonna be just me. It's gonna be me. It's gonna be Chelsea Gray. It's gonna be all the activists in the WNBA. We're gonna come knocking on your front door at the hotel room and say, listen up, Caitlin. You need to come out and publicly denounce all of your fans. You need to come out and publicly say, if you guys are fans of me, you need to stop watching the W.
The thing that separates this moment from other record-breaking performances is what happened immediately after. Instead of the league rallying around the accomplishment, instead of veteran players celebrating the individual excellence on display, something different started brewing. Comments started appearing from established stars. Perspectives started getting shared in interviews. The narrative around what Clark had done started shifting from pure celebration to something way more complicated. And that's when the real story actually began. To understand why some of the WNBA's biggest names started weighing in on Clark's rise, you have to go back to December. Aja Wilson, one of the league's most decorated players, sat down for an interview with Time magazine. It wasn't some random podcast or YouTube channel desperate for clicks. This was a major publication, the kind of platform that reaches way beyond sports fans. During that interview, Wilson addressed the hype surrounding Clark directly. She didn't attack Clark personally. She didn't say anything inflammatory or unprofessional. Instead, she carefully framed her concern around history and narrative preservation. She said the hype around Clark's rise was erasing WNBA history, at least for a moment. She followed that observation up by saying something simple but pointed. I don't like that.
Going to be very important for the W. They could come out of that weekend having a hell of a lot fewer fans. All right? And you may be like, well, oh, they're going to run the homophobes and the racists off. No, they're going to run sports fans off that just don't want to hear about this bullshit. That understand if you put yourself in a public spotlight, you're going to get some creeps to come out. I mean, Caitlin Clark's had these stalkers. Sophia Cunningham's had these stalkers. You notice how nobody talks about that? The media doesn't talk about that. No.
Now, the way Wilson delivered this message mattered. She was careful with her wording. She constructed her argument around legacy and respect for what came before Clark ever set foot on an NBA court. Her exact phrasing was that the hype wasn't a hit at her personally, meaning she wasn't saying Clark's success was taking anything directly from her. Instead, her actual issue was with fans potentially overlooking the players who'd already built the league long before Clark arrived. This is an important distinction because it wrapped frustration in the language of concern. It sounded like Wilson was defending basketball history rather than defending her own spotlight. That framing gave her argument legitimacy. It gave people a reason to take her seriously beyond just dismissing it as jealousy. Wilson has 3 championships and 4 MVP awards to her name. By any objective measure, she's earned the right to speak on the league's history and what came before this current wave of popularity. Nobody's going to argue that she hasn't paid her dues. She's one of the greatest players the WNBA has ever produced. But here's where the pattern emerges, and it's the key to understanding what's actually been happening below the surface. She keeps bringing it up. Almost every single time there's a media cycle around Clark, whether it's a magazine profile, an awards ceremony, or a random press availability, Wilson ends up somewhere in that conversation. She weighs in on the fans. She weighs in on how attention gets distributed across the league. She weighs in on race, privilege, and who gets credit for what.
Caitlin Clark was on a minutes restriction, and for being under 30 minutes, putting 45 points down, 10 assists. Actually, I know she got 6 stocks, but let's just see what exactly they were. She got 4 steals and 2 blocks, and I gotta tell you, she came in clutch.
This isn't a one-time comment or a single interview where she expressed a perspective and moved on. Over 18 months, there have been multiple instances where Wilson has returned to this exact topic. She's given different versions of the same central argument across different platforms. Each time, she's framed it slightly differently, adjusted the language, changed the emphasis, but the underlying message stays consistent. The attention around Clark is problematic because it overshadows what came before. The repetition itself becomes notable. If something genuinely bothered you and you'd made your point clearly, you'd move on. You'd trust that your perspective had registered. You'd talk about other things. But instead, Wilson keeps cycling back to this specific concern across months and interview after interview. What makes this pattern even more significant is that Wilson has never had a direct conversation with Clark about any of this. Not publicly anyway. There's no record of them sitting down, hashing things out, and reaching some kind of understanding. Instead, everything happens through interviews, through carefully constructed statements to journalists, through public processing of feelings that are directed at someone without actually being spoken to that someone directly. It's criticism from a distance, perspective shared with the world rather than with the person the perspective is actually about.
Very interested to see if Caitlin Clark will bow down to the black lesbians and Asia Wilson.
That creates a dynamic where Clark's unaware of the specific grievances being aired, or if she is aware, she's learning about them through media coverage rather than through direct communication. The Time magazine interview in December was significant, but it was really just the loudest version of something that had been happening more quietly for a while. Wilson's frustration wasn't new. It had been building. But when she put it on the record with a major publication, it gave the underlying tension permission to become a larger conversation. Other veteran players started weighing in. The narrative around Clark's arrival shifted. What had been pure celebration of her performance started getting complicated by questions about fairness, history, and who deserved to be the center of attention in the league. And once that conversation started, it didn't slow down. It accelerated. Because for the first time, one of the league's biggest names had articulated something that other players had probably been feeling privately for months. Here's where things get genuinely interesting, Because what happens next tells you the noise around Caitlin Clark has outgrown normal league business. Adam Silver, the commissioner of the NBA, decided he needed to step into this situation personally. Not the WNBA commissioner, Adam Silver himself. Now, that's significant because commissioners don't usually get involved in individual player narratives unless something has genuinely outgrown the sport itself. They have leagues to run, business decisions to make, bigger picture stuff to handle. The fact that Silver felt compelled to address Clark directly, to weigh in on the specific controversies surrounding her, signals that whatever's happening around this player has crossed some kind of threshold. Just this past week, Silver addressed the ongoing swirl around Clark in comments to reporters. His exact phrasing was crucial. He called her a political football. That's not accidental language. That's not something a commissioner says lightly. When you call someone a political football, you're saying they've become a symbol that different groups fight over, way beyond anything that actually happens between the lines. You're saying the conversation has moved beyond basketball into territory that's more about ideology, identity, and competing narratives than it is about the actual sport. Silver was essentially stepping in and saying, "This has gotten too big. This is no longer just basketball business."
Conceivable Silver and the Board of Governors from both leagues will escalate a review of her stats. You almost have to at this point. This league's a train wreck. Silver did not address his role in the Thomas suspension Tuesday, but sources familiar with the situation said Engelbert initially believed during the evaluation process that because no foul was called on the court against Thomas, a follow-up suspension seemed too steep of a discipline. Utter. You have DEI officials who have no business officiating a junior high game. This is me talking, not the article. And everybody knows this. It's like in the NCAA. And these women and men and DEI hires of the WNBA are the worst of the...
In that same conversation, Silver sidestepped a specific question about a suspension report tied to one of Clark's recent run-ins with officials on the court. Instead of addressing the technical basketball question directly, he pivoted to the bigger picture. He talked about the political nature of how everything surrounding Clark gets interpreted. He talked about how she's become a young woman trying to improve her game while simultaneously being caught in something way bigger than herself. He was, in effect, protecting her from becoming completely consumed by a narrative that extends far beyond what she's actually responsible for controlling. A commissioner using his platform to shield a single player from media and fan narratives is unusual enough on its own. But doing it for a 23-year-old rookie in her second season, that's genuinely rare. The phrase political football alone reveals what Silver actually thinks is happening here. He's not saying Clark did anything wrong. He's not saying the controversies surrounding her are legitimate basketball disputes that need to be settled through normal league channels. He's saying she's been weaponized. Different sides are using her as a symbol to argue about things that have nothing to do with whether a foul should have been called in a specific game. She's become a proxy for larger conversations about race, privilege, attention distribution, and social justice. And in becoming that proxy, she's been put in an impossible position where nothing she actually does on the court is going to satisfy everyone, because the conversation isn't really about her performance anymore. Silver's involvement here isn't the first time he's stepped in on Clark's behalf either, even in small ways. Back when Clark took a hard flagrant foul from Kennedy Carter earlier in 2024, Silver publicly commented on it. But instead of letting it become a massive controversy, he called it a welcome to the league moment. He made a specific point of saying it wasn't out of the ordinary and shouldn't be blown out of proportion in either direction. He was essentially telling people to pump the brakes, to not turn a physical foul in a competitive league into something bigger than it was. He was managing the narrative in real time, trying to prevent it from spiraling into exactly the kind of political football territory it's now occupying. But when the actual commissioner of a professional league is fielding direct questions about suspension reports and using phrases like political football to describe one specific player, something has genuinely shifted. The noise around Clark isn't dying down anytime soon, no matter how many times other players insist publicly that it's not personal. It's hardening. It's becoming entrenched. Different sides are doubling down on their perspectives, and in the middle of it all is a young player trying to just play basketball at an elite level. There's something almost darkly funny about the optics here. You've got one of the most powerful executives in American sports going out of his way to shield a rookie-turned superstar from getting swallowed whole by a media cycle that's bigger than she is. That's not something commissioners normally do. That's not part of the job description. Commissioners are supposed to be distant, neutral figures who manage league business from above the day-to-day drama. But Silver clearly felt like this situation required him to step down from that position and insert himself directly. That tells you everything you need to know about how much this particular situation has spiraled beyond what anyone anticipated when Clark first entered the league. Strip away all the careful language that's been floating around the situation for the last 18 months, and what you actually find underneath is pretty straightforward. Some of the WNBA's veteran players are frustrated. That frustration is real. But the way they're packaging and presenting that frustration has become something different from what's actually being felt. They're reframing it as concern about history. They're talking about narratives getting erased. They're making arguments about fair coverage and who deserves credit for building the league. All of that sounds legitimate when you say it out loud. It sounds like they're defending something important. But if you look at the actual pattern of what's been happening, a different picture emerges. These are accomplished, decorated players who aren't used to sharing the spotlight this dramatically. And now they have to, whether they like the terms of it or not. That's the real issue. It's not about what Clark has done wrong. It's not about whether she's disrespected anyone or failed to acknowledge her predecessors. It's about the simple fact that when a player of her caliber enters a league and immediately starts breaking records at this rate, attention gravitates toward her. That's not a conspiracy. That's not unfair. That's just how sports media works. Eyeballs follow excellence. When someone's doing something nobody's ever done before, people want to watch. People want to understand it. People want to talk about it. The careful language about history preservation and narrative protection serves a function. It elevates the conversation above jealousy. It makes it sound principled. It makes it sound like these players are fighting for something bigger than themselves. Legacy, respect, the honor of what came before. And maybe some of them genuinely believe that's what they're doing. Maybe the frustration and the principle are genuinely intertwined in their minds, but the effect is the same regardless of intention. They're talking about attention while simultaneously refusing to shift their focus away from Clark's rise. They're criticizing the media cycle while continuing to feed into it by giving interviews about Clark's impact. They're saying they want the conversation to move back to basketball while spending considerable energy on non-basketball discourse about narratives and fairness. Here's the thing that keeps getting lost in all of this. Clark didn't take a single thing away from anyone by scoring 45 points. She didn't diminish A'ja Wilson's career or Sue Bird's legacy or anyone else's accomplishments by putting up historic numbers. That's not how basketball works. Excellence in the present doesn't erase excellence in the past. Records broken don't steal records that were already set. A'ja Wilson will still have 3 championships. Sue Bird will still have the clutch plays and the winning pedigree. Diana Taurasi will still have everything she accomplished. None of that changes because Caitlin Clark had an incredible game. What actually changed is the media's attention distribution, and that's a completely different thing. The attention isn't a fixed pie where one player's gain is automatically another player's loss. But it sure feels that way to the players who have been the center of attention for years. When you've been the biggest name in your sport, when reporters have been coming to you for quotes and perspective, when you've been the default player that media outlets reached out to for commentary, losing that position is noticeable. It feels like something was taken, even if logically you understand that's not what happened. Clark didn't ask for all of this attention. She didn't orchestrate the media cycle. She didn't go on interviews complaining about the distribution of coverage. She showed up, played basketball at an elite level, and let the numbers speak for themselves. That approach has become the entire contrast at the center of this story. One player keeps doing interviews about optics, fairness, and who's getting talked about too much. The other player just dropped 45 points and dished 10 assists in under 30 minutes of floor time. One side keeps trying to manage the narrative. The other side keeps letting the box score handle whatever narrative needs to happen. The frustration from the veteran players is understandable from an emotional perspective. But the strategy of addressing it through interviews and public statements is actively making the situation worse, not better. Every time someone gives a quote about Clark and fairness and history, it keeps the story alive. It cycles the conversation back. It gives media outlets a fresh angle to report on and keeps the dynamic exactly where the frustrated players say they don't want it. If the goal was genuinely to shift the focus back to basketball, to move beyond the attention cycle, then the fastest way to accomplish that would be to stop feeding the cycle. To stop giving quotes. To stop processing these feelings in public forums where they get amplified and repeated and analyzed endlessly. A'ja Wilson has said publicly, more than once, that she's going to keep doing her own thing regardless of what happens with Clark's fan base or the attention swirling around her. That's a completely reasonable sentiment on its own. Every player should focus on their own game, their own career arc, their own pursuit of excellence. That's basic sports mentality. But here's where the contradiction emerges, and it's important because it reveals something about how people actually handle things versus how they say they handle things. If a player is genuinely unbothered by something, if they truly don't care about it, they usually don't need to explain 3, 4, 5 separate times across 18 months exactly why they aren't bothered by it. Think about how that works in real life. If something doesn't bother you, you move on, you focus on other things, you redirect your energy. You don't keep bringing it up in different interviews to different outlets. You don't construct new angles on the same argument every few months. You don't return to the exact same topic repeatedly when asked about different subjects. The repetition itself indicates that something about this is clearly occupying mental energy, regardless of what the public statement is about unbotheredness. There's a famous concept in psychology about this exact pattern. If someone keeps explaining why they're not bothered by something, the repetition itself is proof that they actually are bothered. If I tell you once that I don't care about a situation, you probably believe me. If I tell you 5 times, you start wondering why I need to convince you so many times. If something truly didn't matter, wouldn't I be able to just move on and not think about it? The fact that I keep returning to it, keep explaining it, keep defending my unbotheredness, suggests that the opposite is true. Something about it is clearly living rent-free in my head. Wilson's pattern fits that exact template. She's given multiple interviews where she's expressed that the attention around Clark doesn't affect her, that she's focused on her own game, that she doesn't pay attention to the noise. Those statements might be sincere. She might genuinely feel that way in those specific moments when she's being interviewed. But the frequency with which she feels the need to make those statements, the consistency with which she returns to the topic, suggests that there's more going on beneath the surface than the public statements indicate. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark hasn't engaged in this pattern at all. She's been asked about the drama. She's been asked about the controversies. She's been asked about what A'ja Wilson and other veteran players have said about her. And her response has been consistent. She doesn't really pay attention to it. She's in season. She has other things to focus on. She's worried about her teammates. She's worried about winning. She's not spending energy on the media narratives or the fan dynamics or who's saying what about her in interviews. And here's the key difference. She's not repeating this message constantly. She gives the answer once and moves on. She doesn't cycle back to it. She doesn't keep explaining it. The contrast is stark, and it extends to how the two players are actually handling the situation on the court and in the public sphere. Clark isn't clapping back at anyone in interviews. She isn't posting subtle jabs on social media. She isn't crafting carefully worded statements that sound concerned, but are actually shots at her peers. She's not doing any of the things that would indicate she's engaged in a public dispute with the veteran players. What she is doing is averaging historic numbers night after night. She's letting the box score handle whatever talking actually needs to happen. She's executing at a level that makes everything else feel secondary. That approach, quietly outproducing all the surrounding noise instead of engaging with it directly, tends to age a whole lot better than the alternative over time. In 5 years, nobody's going to remember the interviews A'ja Wilson gave about fairness and narrative protection. But people are going to remember that Caitlin Clark broke records that nobody had ever broken before. People are going to remember the statistical accomplishments. People are going to remember what she did on the court. The narrative arguments, the careful framings, the public processing of frustration, all of that dissolves. The numbers stay. Wilson has a complete right to feel however she feels about the situation. She has every right to give interviews if she wants to. This isn't about whether she should be allowed to speak. It's about whether constantly speaking is actually an effective strategy for accomplishing what she says she wants to accomplish. If the goal is to shift focus back to basketball and away from narratives, talking about narratives perpetually doesn't work. It's a self-defeating strategy. But if the goal is something else, if it's about establishing a public record of perspective, about defending legacy, about making sure her voice is part of the conversation, then yeah, the interviews make perfect sense. They're working exactly as intended. The question is which goal is actually the real one underneath all the careful language. Now we get to the setup that makes this entire situation genuinely awkward. And honestly, this has been building for a long time, even though people haven't been talking about it directly. A'ja Wilson and Caitlin Clark aren't rivals on separate rosters where the tension can stay at a comfortable distance. They're not opponents who only interact in games and then go their separate ways for the rest of the season. Both of them are on the same team for the 2026 WNBA All-Star Game, which is scheduled for July 25th in Chicago as part of the league's 30th season celebration. They're going to be teammates. They're going to share a locker room. They're going to sit on the same bench. They're going to be photographed together. And they're both going to be wearing the same jersey, while all of this underlying tension exists between them. The rosters for this All-Star game weren't even picked the usual way this year, which adds another layer to the awkwardness. Normally, All-Star selections go through a specific process: fan voting, coach selections, the standard machinery. But this year, because it's the 30th season celebration, the league did something different. They brought in legends, Cynthia Cooper and Teresa Weatherspoon, and let them serve as honorary general managers. These two icons then drafted the teams live on ESPN, turning the entire selection process into its own broadcast event. It was meant to be a celebration, a way to honor the league's history while also showcasing the current talent. And for the most part, it was exactly that. It was exciting, it was engaging, it was fun. But it also put two of the league's biggest storylines on the same team, which creates a situation that everyone's already paying attention to. The draft happened, the rosters were finalized, and now the conversation has shifted from who's on which team to what's going to happen when these two share a locker room. That's the storyline now. That's what everyone's waiting for. Here's the part that makes it even more real. There's already chatter floating around that Wilson wants a word with Clark whenever she sees her at All-Star Weekend. It's not some vague rumor either. It's pretty specific. Wilson, according to multiple accounts, is planning to confront Clark at the event. She wants to have a conversation, whether that ends up being a private sit-down or something more public, with comments dropped courtside to reporters standing nearby, remains to be seen. But the intent is clear. She's not planning to let All-Star Weekend be just about the game and the celebration. She's planning to use the platform for something else. The scenario that some people have been describing is pretty dramatic. They're saying Wilson is going to approach Clark and hand her a letter. They're saying she's going to tell Clark that she needs to come out publicly and denounce her own fans, to tell them to stop watching the league if they're the kind of fans who are engaging in the toxic behavior that's been documented. It's specific. It's confrontational. It's a very different dynamic from just sharing a locker room and being professional about it. It's not just them trying to coexist peacefully while pursuing their own goals. It's an intentional moment where one player is going to try to force a particular kind of action from another player on national television, essentially. The tension in that situation is going to be unavoidable. You can't put two of the main characters in this ongoing saga in the same space during a nationally televised event and expect things to be normal. The cameras are going to be looking for interaction. The reporters are going to be trying to capture it. The fans are going to be watching for any indication of how these two actually feel about each other beyond the careful statements they've made publicly. There's going to be subtext everywhere. A casual conversation becomes significant. An absence of interaction becomes notable. Every moment is going to be loaded with meaning beyond what's actually happening. This is supposed to be a celebration of the WNBA's history. It's supposed to be a moment where the league comes together to honor 30 years of basketball. Instead, it's shaping up to be a potential confrontation between two players about completely different things: legacy, attention, fairness, the future of the league. The All-Star game itself is going to be great basketball, probably. Both teams are stacked with talent. But everyone watching is going to be tuned in for one specific thing. What happens when these two are in the same building, on the same court, wearing the same jersey? That's the real story that's developing, and it's only a week away. Let's just say out loud what a lot of people have been thinking quietly. The official narratives floating around this whole situation, the concerns about officiating, the worries about history being erased, the careful language about fairness and narrative protection, those aren't really what's driving the frustration. Not at the core. If you actually dig beneath all of those carefully constructed arguments, what you find is something much simpler. A group of accomplished, decorated players who aren't used to sharing the spotlight this dramatically, and now they have to, whether they like the terms of it or not. That's it. That's the real story underneath all the careful framing. The veteran players built the WNBA. They invested their careers in growing the league, in making it matter, in competing at elite levels year after year. They sacrificed, they fought, they dealt with underfunding and underappreciation, and all the challenges that came with being in a women's professional sports league in America. And for years, they were the center of attention in the WNBA universe. They were the players that media outlets reached out to for quotes. They were the names that carried the league. They were the ones people paid to watch. And then Caitlin Clark arrived, and the entire attention economy shifted overnight. Not gradually, not over a few years, overnight. A rookie who'd broken scoring records in college, who came into the league with a certain amount of hype, immediately started producing at a level that was genuinely historic. She broke records that had stood for decades. She brought in audiences that hadn't been watching women's basketball before. She became, in a very short amount of time, the biggest story in the WNBA. And for the veteran players, that shift was jarring. It wasn't gradual. They weren't preparing for it mentally. They were just suddenly secondary to a story they didn't write and don't control. The frustration that creates is legitimate, human, understandable. Anyone who's been the center of attention and then suddenly isn't would feel something similar. It's not pleasant. It affects your sense of place in your own league, but here's the critical distinction. That frustration isn't Clark's responsibility to manage or fix. She didn't create the conditions that shifted attention to her. She didn't ask for the media cycle. She didn't orchestrate anything. She just showed up, played basketball at an elite level, and the natural consequence of elite performance is attention. Clark didn't take anything away from anyone by scoring 45 points in a game. She didn't diminish Aja Wilson's 3 championships. She didn't reduce Sue Bird's legacy. She didn't erase Diana Taurasi's accomplishments. Those things still exist exactly as they always did. The box scores are still there. The records still stand. The history still matters. What changed is the allocation of attention in the present moment, not the evaluation of what happened in the past. But the feeling is the same from the player's perspective. They feel like something was taken. Even if they logically understand that's not what happened, the feeling persists. And that's where the language about fairness and history comes in. It's a way of translating an emotional experience, loss of spotlight, displacement from the center of attention, into something that sounds more principled. It sounds like they're defending basketball. It sounds like they're protecting legacy. It sounds noble. But if you remove that language and just look at what's actually happening, it's about attention distribution. It's about who the league is talking about, who the media is covering, whose name is being mentioned most in national conversations. That's real, and it matters to them, but it's different from the official narratives being pushed. The complicating factor here is that some of those concerns about history and fairness might be genuine. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. You can be frustrated about losing spotlight and genuinely believe that previous generations deserve recognition for building the league. You can want more media attention for yourself and sincerely think that fairness demands acknowledging what came before. The human experience is complicated. Multiple things can be true simultaneously. But when you look at the actual strategy being employed, constant interviews about Clark's impact, repeated statements about narrative protection, persistent public processing of these feelings, It's hard to argue that the primary goal is the one being stated. Because if the actual goal was to ensure previous generations got proper recognition, you wouldn't do that by talking about Clark constantly. You do it by creating platforms for those players. You do it by being the voice bringing attention to underappreciated legends. You do it by directing your considerable platform and credibility toward lifting others up. Instead, what's happening is the opposite. Every interview about Clark and fairness is really an interview that keeps the spotlight on the person doing the interview while framing it as concern for others. It's attention-getting dressed up as attention-protecting, and that's a pretty significant distinction. So here's what we're looking at heading into next week in Chicago. Two of the biggest ongoing storylines in the WNBA are going to share a court on purpose, in the same locker room, wearing the same jersey, during a game that's supposed to showcase everything good about where the league has come from rather than extend a media saga that's been quietly simmering since 2024. That's the setup. That's the situation everyone's going to be watching unfold. A'ja Wilson is going to see Caitlin Clark face to face. There are going to be conversations, whether they're private or public or some mixture of both. There are going to be moments where both players are being photographed together, being interviewed together, being forced to exist in the same space despite the very different positions they occupy in this narrative. And here's what's probably going to happen, because this pattern has been consistent throughout the entire situation. Clark is going to show up, play basketball, contribute to whatever team she's on, and let her performance speak for itself. She's not going to make a statement. She's not going to address Wilson directly unless directly addressed. She's not going to try to win an argument in the court of public opinion. She's just going to play. That's been her approach from the beginning, and there's no reason to think All-Star Weekend will change it. Wilson, on the other hand, is going to have her moment. She's going to make her statement. She's going to get her perspective on the record. She's probably going to make headlines by doing it. The media is going to cover it extensively because it's newsworthy, because it's dramatic, because it's the exact kind of conflict that gets attention. And for a news cycle or two, maybe a week or so, people are going to be talking about what Wilson said, what Clark said, what it means, what happens next. That will be the story. But then the season will continue. Both players will go back to their regular teams. Clark will keep scoring at a historic pace. Wilson will keep playing at an MVP caliber level. The All-Star game will become one moment in a long season, significant maybe, but not the defining moment of anyone's career. The attention cycle will shift to the next storyline. Something else will happen. Something else will dominate the discourse. That's how sports work. That's how media cycles work. They burn bright and then they move on. And 5 years from now, when people look back on this era of the WNBA, they're not going to remember the specific interviews that Wilson gave about fairness. They're not going to recall the exact language she used to frame her concerns. They're probably not going to even think about All-Star Weekend 2026 as a particularly significant moment in league history. What they're going to remember is that Caitlin Clark broke records that nobody had broken before. They're going to remember the performances. They're going to remember the box scores. They're going to remember the statistical accomplishments. The narrative arguments dissolve. The numbers stay. And that's really the final argument here, because it brings everything back to basics. This is a sport that settles almost every argument on the court every single night in ways that talk shows, magazine profiles, and press conference sound bites simply cannot touch. You can argue about fairness. You can argue about history. You can argue about who deserves attention and who doesn't. But at the end of the day, one player showed up and scored 45 points and dished 10 assists in under 30 minutes. That happened. That's documented. That's on the record forever. If a player genuinely wants to win an attention argument, they don't do it by talking about attention. They do it the exact same way Clark has been doing it all season long, which is by putting up numbers that nobody can seriously argue with. The reason attention gravitates toward Clark isn't because of some conspiracy or some unfair treatment. It's because she's doing things that haven't been done before. That's how sports attention actually works. Excellence drives eyeballs. So if the veteran players genuinely want the story to shift back toward the actual game itself, the fastest and most effective way to accomplish that is to outplay Clark on the court. Not out-talking her in interviews, not defending legacy in magazine profiles, not making statements at All-Star Weekend, just outplaying her. Nobody is stopping a Ja Wilson from having another fully deserved MVP caliber season. She's clearly more than capable of that. She's proved it this year. She's one of the best players in the league. But you don't win the attention argument by talking about attention over and over again. You win it the exact same way Clark is winning it, which is by putting up performances that nobody can argue with. That's the actual reality underneath all of this. Not the careful language about fairness. Not the concerns about history, just basketball, just production, just excellence on the court. That's what matters in the long run. That's what endures. That's what people remember. Chicago will be the test. Not because of anything that might get said between two teammates who clearly see this current era of the WNBA very differently from each other, but because for one single weekend, everyone gets to watch the two biggest ongoing storylines in the entire WNBA share a court on purpose under one roof for a game built to celebrate the league's history rather than argue over it. Adam Silver will be watching. The media will be watching. Fans will be watching for that moment when the narrative finally peaks and either shifts or explodes. But here's what probably won't happen. Clark won't suddenly change who she is. She won't apologize for breaking records. She won't tell her fans to stop watching. She'll just keep scoring in bunches against defenses that throw everything they have at her. She'll keep setting up her teammates for easy looks. She'll keep breaking records that nobody else in this league's nearly 30-year history has ever come close to touching. The 45-point, 10-assist night against Seattle wasn't some random one-off explosion. It was a preview of what the rest of this season very likely looks like from here. That's the real story nobody's talking about yet.